So welcome to our WiNS seminar. We are super happy today because today we're going to be talking about educational settings, which is something that maybe any of us has some kind of knowledge at some point because we are all embedded in that settings at some point of our lives. So today Lorena is going to be presenting from Chile. So just to give you a little bit of bio about her studies and what is her approach. Lorena Ortega holds a sociology degree from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, a master's degree in education and policy from the University of Melbourne, Australia, and a PhD in education from the University of Oxford, United Kingdom. She is an assistant professor at the Instituto de Estudios Avanzados en Educación and a researcher in CIAE. I didn't know if telling the name in English or Spanish, I get confused. So her research focuses on the application of advanced quantitative methods to address substantive issues around equity and effectiveness in education. Her teaching has focused on the area of sociology of the education policy, and quantitative research methods. Prior to her current position, she worked as associate researcher at the Centro de Justicia Educacional from the same university, Universidad Católica, and as a postdoc researcher at the Department of Sociology on the University of Tübingen in Germany. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. Maybe you should correct me a little. And as an analyst for the PISA program at OECD and France, and researched at the University of Oxford. So Lorena has a lot of experience. Can you tell about all the things that I have been already saying? And also she has been part of many other research projects. So today we're going to be hearing about her research in educational settings. So I'm super happy to have you here, and I give you the stage, Lorena.
Thank you very much, Francisca, for the introduction and for the invitation. Thank you, Alice, as well. I'm really, really happy to be here. I hope you find this talk interest, and I will be mainly talking about research in which I've been involved that has to do with educational settings and equity, and how we can use social network analysis to depict some of the patterns and mechanisms that drive equity or inequalities in education. So I'll share my screen, and you can see my presentation now. Wonderful. So thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know the time zone of each one of you, but I know that we are in different parts of the world. So welcome all. And I was looking at recent reviews on how social network analysis have been has been applied in educational research in the past. So here are some references on that regard. There is a special issue that recently came up on the application of social network analysis in schools settings, and there is also the book by Caroline that reviews these issues. So you can see more about this. But in general, I would say the diagnostic is that social network analysis has been gaining momentum in educational research. However, the adoption of these techniques and conceptual frameworks have been slow compared to how it's been applied in other social sciences fields, for example. And still, there are many topics that are of interest to educational researchers and that can be considered from a social network analysis perspective. Here are just some examples of studies that have looked at, for example, diffusion and adoption of innovations, social influence, belief systems, social capital, homophily, efficacy of interventions, all of them conducted in educational settings. So there is plenty of work that has been done. And in general, I think relational approaches can help us study specifically issues that have to do with equity and effectiveness in complex educational settings. And I will be presenting three main themes of research in which I've been involved, at least with the second and third in more depth, but I think these are very interesting applications of social network analysis, substantive applications of these methods. So the first one is equity in students' social integration. And the idea, the rationale behind this application is that education is a social experience, of course. So the relationships of students with their teachers and with their peers can influence their educational outcomes and opportunities to develop and to learn, of course. So that's why we look at the social context of education. We look at the patterns of relationships in students' micro-social environment in schools. We look also at the predictors or the antecedents of these relationships. And we can also be interested in looking at the effects of these relationships on important educational outcomes. So generally, we can see that there is plenty of work done in terms of friendship patterns and friendship relationships, for example, and more generally social integration and how this can affect, for example, language skills development, or it could also influence field of study choices at school. It could also be addressed in terms of focusing on cross-ethnic relationships or same ethnicity relationships, and also some other important educational outcomes like school belonging. So we look generally at friendship, but we could also look at academic work networks and also like-dislike type of networks. And here, I'm just gonna briefly mention a study that was a seminal study by Moody, and the paper is Race, School Integration and Friendship Segregation in America. And this was one of the first studies that look at interethnic social ties in terms of friendship and academic work, in this case, friendship, and how and this is relevant because these interethnic social ties can decrease interethnic prejudice and improve interethnic attitudes in school communities. And we know also that having social ties with peers from the majority group can also increase the social and human capital of members of ethnic minorities. However, the evidence shows that peer networks are often ethnically and racially segregated. So we have evidence of ethnic homophily in this type of networks. However, it's also been stated that there are important differences in social integration across racial and ethnic groups. So there is very detailed accounts of how different groups, depending, for example, in terms of immigrant groups, the country of origin, the generation, the immigration generation that they belong to, all of these factors can predict their situation, like social position in terms of their friendship networks. So this is just an example of how these methods have been applied to look at social integration of specific groups. Here we have lots of references in case you're interested that look at these type of issues. So the integration of immigrant students or ethnic minorities, and how friendship ties can predict important educational outcomes as well. Another application that I'm more involved in, I would say, it's to study teacher-student interactions within the classroom. So what we have been looking at is how biased are these teacher-student interaction networks. And this is important from a substantive point of view, because we know that the quality of relationships and frequency of interactions with teachers can have a significant impact on a wide range of educational and social outcomes, such as academic achievement, school adjustment, school and classroom engagement, well-being, motivation, expectations, behavior problems, sense of belonging, and peer acceptance as well. So there is plenty of evidence on that regard. However, we also know that teachers tend to interact differentially with students, and some of the variables that are key in how teachers relate to students and interact with students are student gender and immigrant background, for example. These variables usually predict the quality of relations and the frequency of interactions with educators. So in general, what we have found in reviewing this literature regarding gender is that in classrooms, school classrooms, boys receive more attention from teachers, are asked more demanding questions, receive more personalized support, and dominate classroom discussions. If we look at immigrant background, also as a predictor of interactions, we have found evidence regarding lower frequency of positive speech and academic feedback, and greater occurrence of negative remarks and behavior management directed towards immigrant students. And this is particularly important because the teacher's interpersonal behavior is more predictive of educational outcomes for females and for immigrant students. So they are more influenced by the teacher's behavior. And these are two studies that we conducted in Chile that I will briefly summarize for you to show you this approach. The first one is called The Inclusion of Girls in Chilean Mathematics Classrooms, Gender Bias in Teacher-Student Interaction Networks. Here are the authors of this paper. And the motivation for this study was the widening of the achievement gap in maths that we observed in Chile. So as students progress in school, the gender gap in mathematics gets larger, and it's particularly large in low SES schools, so low socioeconomic status schools. These gaps are one of the predictors of study and career choices, and they also have an effect on future work opportunities and conditions. And we were interested in looking at the role of schools and how these gender gaps in math are associated with teachers' influence, so teachers' stereotypes and differential expectations. We know that that can lead, according to the Pygmalion effect, to different actions and different interactions of teachers with students, based on stereotypes and differential expectations. So what we looked was, we looked at the relative position of female students within these teacher-student interaction networks. We wanted to examine also the moderating effect of academic achievement on the relationship between gender and interactions with teachers. We wanted to see whether there was variance across classrooms as well in terms of how girls are included in the interaction networks. And we wanted to explore the effect of teacher gender and gender composition of the class on this variation. So we selected a sample of 79 mathematics classrooms and teachers that taught over 2,000 students from different grades, school grades, in 42 different schools in Chile. And what we did to collect this relational data was to video record a regular math lesson for each one of these classes. And then we used a protocol for classroom systematic observation that we designed to capture dyadic interaction data. So we coded each one of the interactions that involved the teacher during that regular lesson, and we also added information about certain attributes of those interactions. And then we linked this dyadic interaction data to information about the students, the classroom, the teachers, etc. So we combined some methods that was particularly a systematic classroom observation to collect this to produce this data. We also use descriptive social network analysis, and we also modeled the number of interactions of the student with the teacher, and based on a series of predictors. I'll tell you a little bit more about the systematic classroom observation. We observed all the videos and coded these exchanges that involve the teacher, and that consisted of at least one verbal turn. And we depicted also who initiated the interaction, whether it was the teacher or the student. Also, what was the content of the interaction, whether it was focused on social interactions, administrative interaction, behavior management interaction, instructions for tasks, or pedagogical interactions. We had coders, obviously, coding this data and achieve a good inter-rater consistency for them. So here are the sociograms for each one of the classrooms that we studied. Maybe it's not very clear here, but we have girls are the red nodes, and boys are the blue nodes, and the node in the middle is the teacher, the white node. So we can see that each one of the arrows is an interaction with the teacher, and we have some classrooms with several interactions with the teacher. Here the size of the node is weighted by the number of interactions that the student hold with the teacher. So we can see that there are some lessons or classrooms with very few interactions, and also some classrooms where there was kind of an very unequal distribution of interactions, with some students being highly central and some other students being left out of the interactions. And then to summarize the results, I'm not going to show you all the results of the study, but we confirm that there is gender bias in teacher-student interactions. So girls generally interact less frequently with their mathematics teachers, and both in if we consider teacher-initiated interactions, and also if we consider student-initiated interactions. We also found that there was a limited moderating effect of math achievement. So math achievement moderated the differences only in pedagogical interactions initiated by students. So in other words, girls did try to interact more frequently with the teacher, especially high-achieving girls, but they were not reciprocated by the teacher in terms of interacting more with them. So there was also significant variation in the inclusion or the position of girls among classrooms. And this variation was not explained by the gender of the teacher, and was not explained either by the gender composition of the class. So we believe that other measures such as teacher stereotypes, gender stereotypes can explain these different patterns. And then a similar study, but with a focus on the centrality of immigrant students within teacher-student interaction networks. These are the authors of this paper, and the motivation behind this was the fact that there is a growing influx of intra-regional migration in Chile. So the percentage of immigrant students have increased quite rapidly in the country. And they are mainly concentrated in urban areas and in public schools, which usually serve low SES families. The countries of origin are mainly Latin American and Caribbean nations. So countries such as Peru, Bolivia, and more recently Colombia, Venezuela, and Haiti. And the policies regarding regarding immigrant students, the educational policies have mainly focused on securing access to formal education, but there is no much done in terms of actually looking at how immigrant students are included, socially included, and in Chilean schools. So we again wanted to look at the position of immigrant students in these networks and to try to explain the variation in the inclusion of immigrant students across classrooms. Here we focus on a sample of schools, of public schools, where we had a large proportion of immigrant students in the classrooms, and again we coded the dyadic interactions for each one of the lessons that we observed. Again, here are some descriptives on these different lessons or classrooms. And we can see the country of origin in different colors. So we also notice the variation in terms of how central are immigrant students in each one of the interaction networks. And then briefly, as a summary of our results, we found that if we look at student immigrant background on average, we find that this is not a significant predictor of frequency of teacher-initiated interactions. However, there are important differences according to students' country of origin. One of the groups that stood out in terms of a lack of inclusion was Peruvian students that were sort of more invisible, or like more basically interacted less with teachers in all the different types of interactions that we analyze, and interactions with different contents. And then on the other hand, we have also students from Venezuelan origin who were particularly active and particularly strongly addressed in pedagogical interactions. So we can see that there was quite a lot of variation across immigrant groups in terms of how they are included in the interactions with teachers. We also found that there is significant variation across classrooms in terms of how immigrant students are included, and the teachers that had a more negative attitude towards diversity in the classroom approached immigrant students less frequently for pedagogical purposes. So that was an interesting finding as well. Here are some references in this for this application that you might find interesting. And then there is the third application that I wanted to talk about, which has to do with the study of teacher collaboration networks. We know from literature that has to do with educational effectiveness that teacher collaboration can promote school improvement, basically by generating the exchange of resources and capacities to improve classroom practices. And thus we can impact also on student outcomes through this mechanism. So the social capital of schools have been regarded as an important aspect of educational improvement. The information and the knowledge and the expertise that are located in the social networks of educators are key to school improvement initiatives. And so through the links between colleagues, these resources can be accessed and can be used to change beliefs and teaching practices. And in that sense, there's been an interesting application of social networks to study teacher collaboration. And here the literature has mainly focused on analyzing informal collaborative practices. So how these links of like informal relationships and interactions can bring about new knowledge and information and resources to school communities. And so we operationalize teacher collaboration as self-report patterns of specific interactions between educators, which shape support networks and knowledge exchange within schools. The literature has accumulated in this area, and we know, for example, we have confirmed that teacher support networks are generally feature transitive structures, so they are clustered. Sorry, my son is talking to me. Just 1 second. Sorry about that. So he's still on vacation, so we have to entertain him somehow. And then, so the teacher support networks are transitive structures, and we also know that they can these teacher networks can differ quite a bit from one to the other in terms of their internal structures, particularly in terms of the levels of collaboration and the centralization that they can have around influential leaders. We know that there are several predictors of teacher collaboration. So at the context or school level, effective support among educators requires favorable structured conditions like time to meet and support from school leadership, a relatively stable team of educators, among other important predictors. At the teacher level, we also know that strategies for seeking advice are based on perceptions of expertise, experience, or legitimacy of colleagues, and also are influenced by balance. So the idea of prioritizing closeness, reciprocity, similarity, and affect in these relationships. We also know that in general, educators with more experience are asked for support more frequently, and they also they also request less support compared with less experienced educators. There are also some important aspects related to the formal structure of the school, such as having a leadership position. This can predict how central educators are in their support networks. And finally, at the dyad level, we know that educators tend to collaborate with similar colleagues. So there's tendency towards homophily in terms of teacher gender, age, the subject and the level in which they teach, and also their beliefs in terms of their beliefs about teaching. And this is an example that I wanted to show you of this application. This is a study that we conducted recently in Chile with some colleagues that you can see here. And it's called Patterns and Predictors of Teacher Collaboration. This was a mixed method study, but I will focus on the quantitative part of the results. The idea was to investigate the advice-seeking patterns among educators in Chilean public schools and their association with the conditions for collaboration that teachers perceived. And also we wanted to identify teacher and dyad level factors that were associated with a greater probability of both seeking support and being sought for support among colleagues. So we collected data using questionnaires that we gave to educators in these public schools in Chile. We used descriptive analysis, social network analysis with basic measures. We also graphed these different networks, and then using inferential models, specifically agent-based stochastic models, we represented the structure of support networks and the characteristics of the educators that shaped these networks. So at the school level, very simply, we described different features of these schools. And interestingly, we saw very different patterns, even among schools that were very similar in terms of size, in terms of location, like structural conditions. We were able to identify schools that had very different patterns in terms of their networks. Here are the different networks, school networks that we observed, and we have the different roles of educators in different colors. and in degree centrality weighted sizes for the nodes. Leadership teachers, so teachers that were in the leadership team are in orange here, and you can see that they're quite central in most of the networks. And then support teachers, like teachers that in particularly support other teachers for the inclusion of students with special educational needs, for example, were also key actors in some of these networks, the ones in black. And the results at the educator and dyad level, we saw, so these are the results of the SOUM model. We saw that there's a negative effect of density, indicating that the existence of relationships is less likely than expected by chance. We also found that there's a positive significant effect of transitivity, indicating that there are hierarchical triads in these advice networks. Also, there is a significant positive effect of having the same position, the same gender, and similar age, indicating that educators tend to seek support from colleagues with similar characteristics. Then educators with more experience in the school tend to be more sought after as a source of advice as well, so they're more popular. But we found no evidence that educators with more or less experience seek more support for improving classroom practices. And we did not find that at the aggregate level that educators with greater professional development needs will seek more pedagogical support relationships. And then school leaders, compared to other educators, tend to be more sought after as sources of advice, and they tend to ask less frequently for advice at the same time. So general conclusions were that advice is sought from few colleagues, and these links tend to be non-reciprocal, perceived as highly influential, and organized into hierarchical subgroups. We also found that teachers without leadership positions are more active in seeking advice, but the same is not true for those with more professional development needs. Educators in leadership positions and with more experience in the school are more sought after than their colleagues, and educators of the same gender, of similar age, and in the same positions are more likely to look for advice from each other. Here are some references on studies that have delved into this issue, so applying social network analysis to study teacher collaboration. And some studies have also looked at not only networks within the school, but also between or among schools. So how school leaders collaborate with other school leaders or with policymakers to implement reforms or to change schools. And that's also an interesting application. And finally, I think I would like to conclude by identifying some challenges that I have that I perceive in the application of social network analysis to educational research. The first one, of course, is developing capacity for advanced social network analysis. Most of the studies that I have encountered in this area apply basic descriptive social network analysis, and very few actually look at longitudinal networks, for example, and that will allow us to disentangle some of the mechanisms behind these patterns that we have observed. Also, collecting and sharing relational data in educational settings. We know that this is expensive. There are different ways of doing it, but in general, it's not quite easy to collect this type of data, or it's more demanding than collecting like regular individual level type of data. And when I have encountered teams that have collected this data, it's still not very easy to to share that information. It's not kind of going around as much as it should. So there are some exceptions, of course. There are some studies international studies that have been collecting relational data, and they have public access to the data. But at least in Chile, my experience is that it's very difficult to access relational data. Also, applying mixed method approaches seems like an interesting way forward, and it can have a lot of potential for sort of making sense of the patterns that we observe in schools and classrooms. And finally, promoting interdisciplinarity. In Chile, at least, I've seen that psychologists have implemented social network analysis quite a bit, like educational psychologists and sociologists as well, but they tend to work like completely separated from each other. So there's not much sharing of know-how and of resources. So that's something that I think it's important to highlight as well. So that's all from me. I think the presentation went faster than I thought it would be. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope this was of interest. I know that this group it's quite interested in methodological advances, and this might be very descriptive for you, but I think that I'm always motivated by substantive research questions. So and then how we can use these interesting techniques to address them. So I hope this was of interest to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lorena. I saw a lot of applause, like online kind of applause in the participants. I see no more. So right now we have some time to actually make some questions, or if somebody would like to comment something. I know that I saw 2 questions actually in the chat, and maybe the people who did it, they want to just, I don't know, maybe they want to make the questions by themselves, or?
I can start. I had a question earlier in the chat, but I think like it became more clear in the context. So in the beginning, you were talking about the tendencies of teachers to have certain biases because of gender and because of racial background. And I was wondering to what extent that seemed to be things that you observe only in certain contexts, like only in certain countries, or even within countries, only in certain regions. Do you see differences there? And I think you specified later where your data came from. So perhaps my question is more about, are you aware of studies that were looking at similar things, but in different social situations?
Yes, thank you, Alice. Yes, we reviewed the data of, sorry, I'm going to stop sharing screen so we can see each other. We have reviewed this literature, and we found mainly studies conducted in the Netherlands. So there is a group of researchers in the Netherlands conducting this type of research, using not the same observation protocol, but different ways of measuring teacher-student relationships. And we also, and they showed that immigrant students were more peripheral to their teacher-student networks compared to like native students. And also we found a lot of plenty of literature from the US, and this had to do more with the integration of based on race. So basically how Latino students and African American students compared in terms of their interactions with the teacher, and the quantity and the quality of those relationships. So in the slides, there is in the references list, you can see some of these studies. that we reviewed for the article, but there is quite a lot of variation, of course, among contexts and also within specific national context, depending on the immigrant group. You can see that there's lots of differences.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
And Silvia left, but she mentioned whether there was any correlation with the gender of the teacher, and that was something interesting. And I assume that she was talking about the teacher-student interaction study and on how girls are included in math lessons. And we found that teacher gender did not predict or did not explain the variation across classrooms that we observed in terms of the inclusion of girls. So basically female math teachers and male math teachers were relatively similar in terms of their behavior patterns and their relationships towards girls.
Perfect. Hopefully Silvia is going to see the video later on. So any other questions from the public? I see Ella has her hand raised.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I am also an educational researcher, so this is tremendously stimulating for me.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you if you had explored or if you have any work regarding online interactions of students. My research focuses on online learning. I do work with adult learners though, and I know that literature says that the interactions are similar sometimes, that we believe them to be super different when we are face-to-face or online, but it actually they do resemble a little bit. Do you have any work on that, or you have any ideas? Yeah.
Thank you, Ella. Well, unfortunately, no, I don't have any experience with that type of data. I have seen articles about this, especially in higher education, and how how students work in online learning environments. I know that after the pandemic, this was particularly an issue, of course, with students having to relate mainly through online platforms. Unfortunately, I don't have data on this, but it will be very interesting to see how it looks in Chile. I know some studies that have been conducted in Chile that show that the position of the students in these online networks predicts kind of success in the course, and also can predict like continuing studying in education and not dropping out. So it's like a measure of engagement, if you wish. But no, unfortunately, I don't know much more about these sources of data. But I think it's quite a good opportunity. This data can be collected or be accessed very easily compared to self-reports that we have to sometimes give in person to students, because if we do kind of online questionnaires, we don't get as much in terms of response percentage of responses that we need. So I think that's a great way forward as well. Thank you, Ella.
Thank you. I'll be looking for the studies. I'll be asking more.
Yeah, if you send me an email, I can send you the reference if you want.
Okay.
That was quite an interesting study that I saw.
Great. I have one last question. If nobody else have any questions, maybe I'm going to use the microphone right now. I was wondering if you have the opportunity to share these kind of results with people in the schools or the students or teachers. What about their reaction about these topics, and how has been your experience with that in that sense?
Yeah, we created reports for the school, like the authorities, the school authorities, but of course we anonymized the results, so they didn't have the information about which specific teacher was doing this or that, or which specific student. And we also did the same for the collaboration, teacher collaboration study that we conducted in England. I didn't mention these results, but the reference is also in the slides, I think, where we showed these different these sociograms to school leaders, and they were able to make sense of them by and giving us also very rich information regarding why these patterns of teacher collaboration, for example, look like they did. For example, they would explain, you know, this is a new head teacher, like a new director in the school, so that's why it's not as central as you can see in other schools, or this person has been in the school for a really long time, and even though he or she doesn't have a formal position as a leader, he or she is actually an informal leader, and things like that. So that's why I think a mixed method approaches are very interesting and useful, because we can't really know what's happening, what has happened in the history of the school that can kind of help us to make sense of this. So yes, we have shared this information at the aggregate level with schools, and we also had a follow-up for the teacher-student interaction networks. We selected teachers that were very, very inclusive of this was for a separate study, very inclusive of students with special educational needs. So that was another application that we were looking at, so how students with special educational needs, how they interact with the teachers, and this was interesting. And we looked at those teachers in very inclusive classrooms, and those teachers that were the less inclusive in terms of the interactions with students with special educational needs. And then we interviewed them and found some interesting differences in terms of their beliefs, their preparation, the training regarding special educational needs, etc. So that's what we have done in terms of going into more depth and to kind of trying to disentangle some of the patterns that we saw. Thank you, Francisca.
I can see Daniela raise her hand. Do you want to?
Yes. Hi, hello everyone. Congratulations, Lorena. I think your work is really inspiring. And
thank you very
much. Taking a look at some of the graphs that you presented regarding immigrant status within the classroom. And if I saw correctly, you showed some immigrants being very centralized in Chilean classrooms. And I was wondering what was the, maybe if you could identify some individual characteristic why these immigrant students were centralized. Maybe they were, I don't know, popular, or because this is really important for their connection with the rest of the class, right? Like, and we are trying to improve their integration and well-being in general. So I think that was really interesting for me to see. So if you can explain a little bit more about that.
Sure. Thank you, Daniela, for the question. Yes, we saw that there were interesting differences in terms of how central different immigrant groups were, and very clearly some countries of origin like Peru or also Bolivia, for example, were more peripheral. And this also coincides with students who are second-generation immigrants, whereas the students who are first-generation immigrants, who are more likely to be from Venezuela, from Colombia, they were much more integrated or much more active and popular in teacher-student interactions. So we controlled, for example, for achievement. So math achievement was controlled. And so this doesn't have to do with how good they are in maths. So that was also interesting. This This was in general a good predictor of teacher-student interactions. But even if we control for that, we still see these differences across countries of origin. We also control for where students were seated in the classroom. So whether they were near the teacher desk or whether they were back at the end of the classroom. That also predicts teacher-student interaction, so the frequency of teacher-student interaction. So if you're closer to the teacher, you will be more likely to interact, but that did not explain the differences among immigrant groups. So what we think is happening is that in Chile, we have these recent waves of immigration that have, in a way, because of historic reasons, have led to perceiving different immigrant groups as high or low status immigrants. For example, immigrants from Venezuela and Colombia are seen by the school communities as coming from families who are highly educated, who are very motivated about life chances and educational opportunities and going to higher education. So they are perceived as more engaged, the families and the students, whereas students from Peruvian background and their families are seen as kind of lacking the drive for education and sort of there's lots of qualitative studies in the Chilean context about this. So discrimination and xenophobia or racism in schools in Chile, so in school communities, and how this impacts on students' integration with peers and also with the broader school community. So I think that that's one potential explanation. So how these groups are seen as in terms of a hierarchy of social status and educational status, that doesn't necessarily predict a real achievement, but it's part of the beliefs of stereotypical beliefs of the school community and can have an influence on how they interact with teachers. Sorry, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lorena.
Thanks to you, Daniela. So, Daniela, just to add, there are the qualitative studies that look at this are, for example, Emilia Tillú from Universidad de Chile, and several other authors that we also reference in the study if you want to look at that. Those are really interesting studies. Thanks.
I think we have one last question from Lorene. Can you just unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. Hi, thank you to the organizers, and of course, it was really interesting, Lorena. I had a question related to, I don't remember if it was the second to last study that you, or kind of like research that you presented on, but it was related to the conclusions around like advice seeking, related to whether teachers had leadership positions versus, I think one of the conclusions, I think it was a second bullet point, sorry, I screenshotted it because I knew I would forget, is it says teachers without leadership positions are more active in seeking advice, but the same is not true for those with more professional development needs. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to like what was meant by that and like how those things were operationalized. A lot of my work is related to like youth serving workforces and professional contexts within natural settings, right? So not necessarily within clinical settings, but whether it's like youth mentoring, counselors, summer counselors, or teachers or early intervention providers. So I'm curious around like how their needs for professional development influences their interaction with other professionals, other kind of disciplines as well. So I was really curious about that.
Sure. So I'm not sure if this was the one you mentioned, or this slide, or maybe the conclusions one.
Yeah, it was the conclusions one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's the second bullet point, right? So yeah, I can tell you a little bit more about how we collected this data. So we gave questionnaires to all of the educators of the participant schools. We asked them to nominate colleagues, up to 5 colleagues, in terms of who do you go to when you have to, when you need advice regarding improving teaching practices, something like this. So very specific. Who did you go to for advice in the previous school year in regard to improving teaching practices, something like this. So they were able to nominate up to 5 colleagues, and we had information from the same questionnaire about their leadership positions, so whether they were the teacher director or the teacher, we have a specific name for that, but it's like kind of like technical advice leader, so more concerned about pedagogical needs of teachers, and some other leadership positions that we have. And what we found was that teachers that didn't have leadership positions, so the teachers that were only kind of like classroom teachers, were more active in seeking advice. So if you don't have a leadership position, you will be more likely to approach your colleagues and ask them for advice, compared to those who are leaders, who so the leaders were popular in the sense that more people will go to them, but they were less active in terms of seeking advice. But we also wanted to know, we had a measure, we had a scale that we also included in the questionnaire, and that had to do with the professional development needs that teachers had, whether they had high levels of professional development needs or low levels of professional development needs. And so we were expecting to find that teachers with high levels of professional development needs will be more active in terms of seeking advice. And it was very surprising to us to find that that was not the case. So those who were those who assessed themselves as having needs for professional development were less active in their advice links, or so what that was quite interesting. So they are not really looking for advice, but they feel like they need to improve some of their teaching capacities. So yeah, that's what I found.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that piece right there was the one I wasn't really clear on, so it's really helpful to hear how it was measured, and really important, right, as it relates to kind of like workforce capacity building, because we want to believe that those like with less experience are going to seek more out, and it seems like, well, it may not actually be the same for perception of professional development need, which may not be the same obviously as experience, but it tends to correlate. So it's surprising, right? How do we assess need? A lot of the work that we do is like assessing the need, and then how the degree to which they would share that is concerning, right? Because how then we would support them, obviously. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks to you. And actually, yeah, we also know from evidence in Chile and abroad that the most effective type of professional development for teachers comes from the same school. So comes from your colleagues. These type of interventions or development opportunities are much more effective than hiring a specialist from outside the school and coming to deliver a course or a workshop. And so it is particularly important that the resources and the knowledge that the teachers have in their school is kind of shared and flows, in the network. But that doesn't seem to be the case, at least in the schools that we studied. And this is this effect that we found, so that the teachers with more professional development needs are less active in seeking advice. That was after we controlled for experience and the other variables in the model. So it doesn't necessarily reflect age or experience in this case, or it's something else. So that's something that we could continue looking at. So thank you for your question.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lorena, for your talk, and everyone who was participating today. It was a great conversation, and I think we learned a lot, right? So thank you so much to everybody. That's it for today, but next week we are going to have another person who's going to be presenting from actually the University of Washington. It's going to be Doris Boina, and she's going to be next Monday. So see you, hopefully everyone, next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much for your time and your interest, and looking forward to the next seminars.